Ladies and gents, my name is Matt Locke and you're listening to, and perhaps watching, the Unleashing Potential podcast. It's in these episodes that I chat with a range of progressive individuals who are unleashing their potential on the world around them at work and in life. With that said, I'm glad you're here so you can join me as we take a deep dive with today's guest. Melanie, welcome to the podcast. It's a pleasure to have you here. How are you doing at your end?
I'm doing well. Thanks so much for having me on your show, Matt.
No, not at all. And before we start, I have to say congratulations on authoring your book, Kicking and Screaming. And of course, we're going to dive in and find out much more about that book. But before we do, I'd love for you to tell our audience a little bit about yourself. Who are you, Melanie? What's your backstory?
Okay, so if you can tell by my accent, I live in Texas in the United States. I live in the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex, which is one of the big metropolitan areas of the state. And I've lived here since college, but I grew up in the western part of the state. I'm a rural small town girl living in the big city. So I love the arts. I love music. I love martial arts. And so that's me personally. Professionally, I've worked in the healthcare industry for nearly 20 years. I started out as a medical librarian. That was career number one in one of our hospitals. So I did research for patients, nurses, doctors, all of the clinical staff. And then I needed a change and I moved into our training and development department. And that's what I've been in for the last 10 years. So I do things like design classes, teach workshops, a little bit of leadership coaching. So it's a mix. And of course, that's been very interesting working for a healthcare company and for a pandemic for nearly 2 years. So it's been an interesting ride.
Yeah, absolutely. And when was it? I guess so your book, Kicking and Screaming, is a memoir of madness and martial arts, which still makes me smile. I think it's fantastic title and subtitle.
Thank you.
How long ago did you finish writing that memoir?
I finished writing it because the book is never really done. Probably when I did the final edits about this year, early 2021. But I really started it around early 2015. Most of the book takes place between 2013 and 2015 when I restarted my Taekwondo training. It was getting ready for my black belt test. So that's when I had the idea to start writing the book. And I probably finished a draft in about 9 months that year. And then I worked on it off and on. I learned how to write queries and pitch to agents and publishers and things like that. So I did that for a few years. And then I finally got hooked up with my publisher, She Writes Press, in 2019. So it's always been a work in progress. I would say if I were to do another book a second time around, I'd probably hire an editor and a copy editor way earlier into the process. So yeah, if I could go back and tweak some things now, I probably would, but they won't let me.
Oh, it's your book. You can do whatever you want. For sure you can. Second edition coming up. No, but yeah, you mentioned Taekwondo, and obviously that's heavily embedded within the title of your book. And you began at a very early age and then took some time off. So just talk us through the Taekwondo journey. And I guess what's interesting after 20 plus years of coming back to that, also the motivation of what it was that brought you back. But you were what, 10 years old when you were practicing?
I was about 10 years old. And for some reason that I can't remember, I told my parents that I wanted to learn karate. Now, I was not an athletic kid. I was a very good swimmer. My dad was a high school and collegiate swimmer, and he taught me. So I've been in the water since I was a baby. And that's about the only sport I was good at. I did not like physical education class. I could not place team sports very well, basketball or volleyball or any of that. But for some reason, I wanted to do karate. I don't know if I'd even seen the Karate Kid. I was just aware of it, and I thought it looked cool. So it turns out in my little town, there wasn't a karate school, but there was a Taekwondo school. And Taekwondo is a Korean martial art. It's very similar to karate. I think if you look back far enough, they have very similar, the same lineage. So it's based on striking, kicking, punching, blocking, sparring, things like that. So we went to watch a class, and I was a little apprehensive at first because I really didn't think my parents would make good on it. And so we went to watch a class, and I was enamored with it. I thought it was magical. I loved it. It was just so exciting. And so we took class as a family. My dad, mom, and my younger brother and I took class for probably 2 years or so, and I really loved it. I grew to really dread the sparring part of it, the fighting part of it, not because I was afraid of being hit, but I think I was a pretty high strung, anxious child anyway. And it can be stressful, and I didn't know what to do, and I just froze up, and I really didn't like that part of it. I like it now, but I didn't like it as a kid. And so things just happened around when I was 12. I started junior high, so next level of school, and my dad changed jobs, and life just happened, and we stopped going. I got into other interests. I got into theater and band, and went on to high school and just had other interests. So it had always been something I was fond of. In the back of my mind, it was something I did as a kid. I enjoyed, but I never really thought I would do it again. And so I get into my 20s and 30s, and meanwhile, this whole time, mental illness has been plaguing me. Started feeling things like depression and anxiety at a very young age. An eating disorder took over at about age 13. I never addressed it because I was a perfectionist and just thought that's something you didn't talk about. It's just something you stuffed down and dealt with and went to school and work and pretended it didn't happen. So I got to a point where I just couldn't take what my mind was doing anymore. I was making terrible relationship choices. My moods were very volatile. I was becoming more and more dependent on alcohol to get me through every night. And so by this point, this was about 2013, I was maybe 32. I was seeing a psychiatrist, I was seeing a therapist. So I had a baseline for my mental health. I wasn't suicidal, so I wasn't in imminent danger, but I was still in danger of just wrecking my life and making myself miserable. And so I thought, I've got to do something really drastic to stop me in my tracks, to give me a distraction, to give me something positive and wholesome and healthy to focus on. And I remember at the time I'd been in this little short-lived relationship with some guy, and I'd said to my mom, if this doesn't work out, maybe I'll go back to Taekwondo. And I didn't really think much of it. Well, that relationship didn't work out. And so I was making myself miserable every night, crying, lonely, feeling sorry for myself. And I just thought, well, why not start now? So I discovered through a little internet searching that my instructors out in West Texas reported up to a grandmaster, so a higher ranking Taekwondo instructor than them. They had trained with him. And he operated his school here in Fort Worth, where I live, which was very close to Dallas in the North Texas area. I didn't really pay attention to that when I was a kid, but I remembered him. He used to come to tests and tournaments, and he was very kind of an imposing old Korean man, so very intimidating. But I found his school about 5 miles from my house and thought, okay, my search is done. I'm going to start training with him. And I did. I started, and it wasn't like it was an overnight change, but I felt the positivity pretty quickly. Just getting out of the house, changing up my routine, giving something to focus on. And over time, I built friendships, I built a community, and my self-confidence and self-actualization just soared.
Yeah, which obviously great to hear. So how long has that been now you've been actively back into Taekwondo without aging yourself? Unless you want to.
I don't mind aging myself. I think all my injuries age me. So that was 2013. And so that was about, let's see, that was what, 7 or 8 years ago. So I'm 42 now. I'll just go ahead and age myself. So I was about 33 when I started. I'm 42 now. And it keeps me young-ish, but it also shows me where it hurts. So yeah, about 7 or 8 years active back into practice.
Yeah, look, I appreciate you being so candid and generous and vulnerable in talking about your struggles with mental health. And it's not uncommon that finding our way back to, or for the first time, maybe into a sport and some sort of physical and mental activity that helps with that, both in terms of structure, as you say, lifestyle behaviors, changing routine, structure, community, focus, all of those things, which you said you found and still find with Taekwondo. I'm interested how, if you're happy to share, how's that affected your mental health in very practical terms? I mean, you said that you were previously, you're just making bad choices, perhaps in your relationships, for example, and in life generally. Now that you've been actively back into a sport that you're passionate about and it's given you focus on all of those things, how's that helped your mental health to evolve?
I think in one way it's helped me be less hard on myself. So when you have something like an eating disorder, that's something I've been recovering from this year, is that you tend to be a perfectionist and you're very tough on yourself. You have to be perfect at everything. You have to be perfect in school and work and your appearance and everything else. And so it's interesting when you practice Taekwondo, there is a bit of perfectionism to a sport as well, which I'm sure is the same for many sports, as you're constantly striving to be better. You're constantly striving to learn something new. And if not perfect something, then master something. So in learning that, though, I was able to undo some unhealthy thinking patterns of really judging myself harshly, thinking, oh, I'm a bad person because I can't do this movement perfectly. And I stopped doing that. I got a lot of positive feedback from my instructors. And it's kind of a safe place to fail. That's what I like about sports, is that it's a safe place to fail. Is that, if you lose a match or you lose a game or something, that's it. You lost a game. No one died. You didn't lose all your money. You didn't lose your house. So it's a safe place to learn about yourself and to learn and grow and fail when you need to, and then celebrate your triumphs when you have them. So in kind of relearning how to learn, I realized that it's okay to not be perfect, because you have a lot of plateaus and setbacks in a sport too. Have plenty of those. And then I would get over that hump, whatever that was, and progress, and then go back a little bit and then progress. And so in seeing that and seeing, well, the world's not going to end if I, don't break this board on the first try, or maybe my sparring partner gets more points than I do. The world didn't end. I didn't die. It's okay to not be perfect. And in learning something as picky as a martial art in a weird way, that started to curb my perfectionism that I had. I was so tough on myself in all these other areas in my life.
Yeah, perfect. It resonates deeply, I have to say. Out of interest, that the celebrating the triumphs and the mini wins, the terminology we would use, but the triumphs, is that something you have found yourself doing more in your non-Taekwondo life as a result of learning the power of that and the benefit of that within Taekwondo?
Yes, I think so. I think it's helped me regulate my emotions and have a clearer perception of the world around me. So I'll give an example that is in the book without going into too much detail, is that a certain situation ends. And in the past, I would have just completely fallen apart, crying my eyes out, miserable for days, emotional roller coaster. And while I was sad and I was disappointed, I think I said like the tsunami of tears never came, is that I just kind of looked back on this somewhat setback. It was actually a good thing, in the end, that this thing ended. But I looked back and like, oh, that's a thing that happened, but life goes on, and I still have myself. I still have Taekwondo. I started to rely on myself instead of all these external pieces of validation. And so I learned to take disappointment better. Instead of throwing a tantrum like a little kid, or thinking the world was going to end, I could just think, okay, that was a setback, but things are going to get better. Sun is still going to come up tomorrow. I can still go about my day. I still have my responsibilities. So you just have to keep going.
Yeah, absolutely. Such valuable lessons, aren't they? And so I'm interested, you mentioned that in the last year, you've been managing the eating disorder. Again, that was something you mentioned back in your childhood. Is that something that's been with you consistently from childhood, or?
I think so.
Yeah.
And when you're in denial about it so long, it's easy to say, oh, it wasn't so bad. I used to tell myself, I don't have an eating disorder. I just kind of have poor body image and disordered thinking about food. But no, I had a full-blown eating disorder. It started around the time I was 13, and it was like just a switch got flipped, and all of a sudden I thought, oh, I don't like my body. I need to do things to change it. It's like I turned 13 and all of a sudden the shape of my body mattered. And it kind of ebbed and flowed over the years, depending on what was going on in my life. Now, Taekwondo has been great. Martial arts have been great, but we've all been through a rough year with 2020 and 2021.
Yeah,
and that set me back. That set my mental health back. I had a major injury, and that's a whole other experience that'll change your life and change your mental health. But at the beginning of this year, we had a couple of difficult things happening. We had our what we call snowvid here in Texas, or our snowpocalypse. We had this horrible ice storm, and won't go into all of the, yes, in Texas, it was very bizarre. It was freezing temperatures in Houston, which is tropical, really.
Yeah.
So, and the frustrating thing was, I won't get too political here, but it's on its own power grid as opposed to the rest of the country. And we have a very stubborn government that is very greedy and corrupt. And so they shut off, they had rolling blackouts. And so some people were without power for days, all this stuff. It was very traumatic. I was so worried about the pipes bursting. I live in a second floor condo, so I was worried about flooding my neighbors. And so for some reason, that was very traumatic to me. Meanwhile, in my job in this healthcare company, there were a couple of big projects we had to do. Now that's normal, you know, that's life in the corporate world. But it was almost this frantic energy around it, like, we got to do this now, we got to do this now, we got to do this now. And so, and you throw in the mix of the unknown of a pandemic, which is hugely stressful on a healthcare organization. So that, the winter storm, recovering from an injury, not being able to move around, I started restricting food. And that was my way of dealing with it. And my anxiety shot through the roof. I started kind of having bipolar mood cycling, which I hadn't had in a long time. So I finally started seeking mental health or mental health professional help again, which is fine. You know, we go through phases where we need it. And the psychologist said, you know, I think you have an eating disorder. And I was like, what are you talking about? Because I had admitted to restricting food, obsessively weighing myself, tracking all of it on my phone. I track my weight every day and how much time I exercised. And so it was really one of the best things to happen to me, because I could finally admit that I had this health condition. When I got diagnosed with bipolar disorder and depression and anxiety 10 years ago, that was kind of scary, but it was also freeing in a way, because now you could see what you're dealing with. You could see the monster. It came out of the closet and you can see what you're dealing with. And with the eating disorder, when I could finally admit I have an eating disorder and it's controlling my life, then we saw the monster that we could do battle with. And so I've had successful recovery since then, finally admitting that this is what I'm dealing with, instead of just being in denial and pushing it off and pretending that it's not there, and continuing to use those unhealthy coping skills and behaviors. So, you know, Taekwondo wasn't magical. It helped a lot. Had I not done it, I'd be in a much worse place than I am now. But, you know, I still have to internally make sure I'm coping in healthy ways and using the tools that I've learned. Even Taekwondo is not the external force that can save me. I really had to learn how to save myself from these situations.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, and in case anyone was, I don't think they were, but it would. But in case anyone was thinking, oh, it's a silver bullet, that's not the case at all. I mean, it's just giving you, it's a very physical sport. It's a very mental sport. It's, I imagine, a great community to be a part of, and as you say, being supportive and a safe place to fail and all of those things. I mean, that's all invaluable, but it's just part of the story, isn't it? That's part
of the story. Yeah. You have to still keep doing the inner work on yourself. And in fact, I have an article coming out on the website Martial Journal next month. It's just kind of a collective of martial arts writers online. And I pose the question, can you be addicted to your martial art? So as much as Taekwondo has helped me, and yes, the book is a great story, you have to be careful that you don't become so dependent on that thing that, you know, that is the thing that's responsible for your happy mood or for having a good day and all that. You still have to do that work inside yourself, independent of your job, your relationship, the hobby that you love. It still has to come from within. And that's something I've had to learn over time. Taekwondo has been the thing that's taken me from way down here to way up here, close to the top of the mountain, but I still have to get myself there.
Yeah, absolutely. I was listening to a great podcast recently with Rich Roll. I don't know if you're familiar with Rich Roll, but great, the Rich Roll podcast, excellent. And he was chatting with the doctor all about Dopamine Nation, actually, is her book that they were discussing. And he certainly is a reforming alcoholic. And I think a little bit of substance abuse, predominantly an alcoholic, was his thing, let's say. And he became very much into ultra distance triathlon, ultra distance running. And he said, even today, a number of people say, well, you just replaced one addiction for another. And he said, in terms of feeding that addictive need for routine and focus, sure, no debate there, but it's an addiction to something that's not harmful, as opposed to, in his case, alcohol. And so for those, and I have an addictive personality for sure, and yeah, similar path to Rich Roll. Absolutely fell into the world of endurance sport, as opposed to going down the path of probably enjoying alcohol too much and so on, and never into drugs. And never went down that path. So, you know, not making that claim at all, but I had the possibility of doing that, and so went down and chose a path of, you know, a sport that would just consume my life. I mean, I didn't possibly have the chance to go down the other path. But I think that's the key, isn't it? The fact that it's not, even if it is the addictive nature of it, or your addictive personality latches onto, in this case, Taekwondo, in my case, ultra endurance stuff. If it's not a harmful endeavor, if there's no downside to that endeavor, only upside, then hey, is there a problem with that?
Yeah, I think it's okay. And maybe it's recognizing that I'm probably always going to have an addictive personality or tendency about me. So why not feed it with something healthy?
Yeah,
And then
absolutely.
try to take those good feelings. I mean, I can't duplicate that shoot of dopamine when you're in a sparring match. Your adrenaline's running and somebody's
Sure.
trying to hit you in the face and you're trying to hit them in the face. So I can't completely duplicate that sitting in front of my computer or something. But I can think about those life lessons and think about how I can persevere through tough times. So I've spent most of this year not practicing much Taekwondo because of a knee injury, but I still think about some of those mental benefits of Taekwondo, like the community that I still try to stay in touch with while I'm recovering, or just the mental perseverance. Sometimes reminding yourself of thinking, well, you know, let's say if you're a marathon runner, I ran 26.2 miles. If I can do that, I can do anything. I remember the first time, because I did long distance running for a while, I ran 10 miles. And I since did half marathons and stuff, so I've ran more miles than that. But that is one of my proudest moments, because I remember thinking, if I can run 10 miles, I can do anything. And that stayed with me. I don't really run much anymore, but that feeling has stayed with me. And that I've thought about that during difficult times. Like, you ran 10 miles. That's a big deal. Not a lot of people do that. So that's something Taekwondo has given me too. Like, I tested for black belt. I've fought teenage boys half my age and twice my size, and I live to tell the tale. So it's, if I'm going to be addicted to something, why not something as great as that?
Amen. Absolutely. I can only agree. Now, I'm interested, and it's not self-serving, but in my book, Lead by Example, chapter 4 focuses very much on the journey of a female athlete, everyday athlete. And I'm interested that it's almost classic that it was the age 13 that you switched and you just had other hobbies, other interests come into your life, and Taekwondo fell away. And the eating disorder started, and it's not uncommon. I mean, it's really common, in fact, for girls, particularly girls of that age, to become very body conscious. I mean, hormones are flowing, lumps and bumps start to appear where they weren't before. For sure, boys may or may not become interesting. Certainly, I think, as you said, caring about the way you looked more. And it's not uncommon, for young girls at that age range to drop out of sport for that reason, but also a lot of eating disorders tend to be they start around that kind of age range. And I'm conscious that our audience, we have a lot of parents. And if you're willing, I'd really appreciate if you could share what that actually looks like. Someone who's been there, to help both parents try and to be more aware of some of the signs they could look out for, but also to deepen their understanding of why is that occurring. And because I know that some parents I speak to have suffered, have gone through that, and they say, oh, what did we do wrong? They blame themselves. They take the responsibility onto themselves for their child having an eating disorder. And I'd love if you could just share a bit more to give a deeper insight, I guess, from someone who's been there and
Yeah,
has
love to share
an
that
understanding of it.
and love to help. And I think seeking to understand is one of the best things a parent can do. Now, I kept it a secret from my parents for, up until recently. I think if they looked back in hindsight, now that they know, they probably would have noticed some things. But when you have an eating disorder,
Right.
you can be good at keeping secrets. So unfortunately, parents, your kid may be keeping secrets from you. While I did say you worry about your appearance, that's really kind of a superficial reason as to why somebody might have an eating disorder. Because if it's just, you know, I think even when I started therapy this year as a woman in my 40s, my dad was still kind of trying to be the parent. And he said, well, you look fine. You're very thin. And he said that as if it were a compliment. And I said, Dad, I
Yeah,
have a
yeah.
mental illness. It's a mental illness. It's not just a desire to be skinny, or sometimes boys feel like they have to look very muscular, because boys and men can have eating disorders too.
Oh, of course.
It goes deeper
Yeah.
than that. If you treat it as a mental illness and not something centered around vanity or appearance, then you can start tackling it. That makes it sound big and scary, which it is, but that's the right way to look at it, is that it's a mental illness. Much of it is very focused on perfectionism. So if there are ways maybe for parents to show your kid that it's okay to not be perfect, maybe you know, it depends on what they're into, grades or sports or activities, is help them in do these things and succeed to a sense, but most of all have fun. It's not about being perfect. Maybe take the pressure off of them if they're playing certain sports, or, you know, you have to get into this college, you have to do this, you have to do that. Eating disorders like structure. So they may cling to these really high expectations, and that can be dangerous. So I wish I had a magic formula or a magic wand, but I would just say, if I could look out for the biggest thing, is look out for the perfectionism. And as a parent, maybe do some self-reflection and think, am I perpetuating that with my child? Or is there a way I can show them that, you know, you're fine the way you are? And be open about talking about mental health. So say they're crying, they're angry, which a lot of teenagers do. They go through those changes. Don't ridicule them for their feelings, especially boys. So they're going to be volatile emotions. So encourage your child to express how they're feeling, even if it's something that makes you feel uncomfortable. You know, we want to comfort people if they're crying or upset and say, oh, no, it's not that bad. Well, that just discounts how they're feeling. So I could probably talk about this for hours, but I think that would be a thing too, is don't discount the emotions that somebody is having right now, even if it makes you uncomfortable. Listen, seek to understand and talk through it, and seek out resources. I grew up in a part of the state where there still are not great mental health resources. It's a rural, isolated part of the state. So if you happen to live in a small town or an area like that, see what you can find online, see what you can do virtually. Telemedicine is a great thing. So yeah, I could probably, again, talk about this for another 2 hours, but those would be my things. Watch the perfectionism and listen and seek to understand the emotions you're feeling rather than just shutting them down.
Sure, and great advice, clearly. I'm interested, it was only relatively recently that you actually shared your secret with your parents. Interested, what was the catalyst? Why now, or why then, if it was recently? And also how you approached that conversation.
Well, the catalyst was money. So I live in the United States where healthcare is expensive. And we kind of have to fend for ourselves and pay for it ourselves, or
Yeah,
whatever our
sure.
employers will help us with. So I was seeking treatment for my depression and other things, and I was going to have these counseling sessions with a nutritionist. They said, well, they're going to be $150 per session, which I'm fortunate enough I can afford that, but I was still really outraged, because usually something like that may be around $30 to $50, typically, say a
Right, right.
counseling session or something, or a visit to a doctor. And so I was so angry. And I was talking to my dad, and it wasn't a big surprise. I mean, they kind of knew I had problems, and I talk about it in my book. So they knew that I'd had problems over the years, but I don't think any of us had really recognized that I have been officially diagnosed as having an eating disorder. And so my dad was kind of trying to help me. He said, well, you're smart. Can't you just read books on it and figure out what to eat? And I said, and that's when I finally realized, I said, Dad, it's a mental illness. I need professional help. So I haven't talked about it a lot with them, but I'm a lot more open about it now. You know, I try to watch the language that we have. I have a 1-year-old niece, and I've made it clear with my mom and her mother and everybody. I said, let's use positive language when we talk about our bodies and food in front of her, even when she can't understand right now. You know, we don't want to say things like, oh, I ate so much at Thanksgiving, I feel so bad about myself, I better go work off all this food, or, oh, I feel fat in these pants, things like that. Because a child can soak all of that in. So I've had to learn the hard way to get through this, but I'd like for my niece to have a better setup in life and more positive role models and more positive language. So hopefully she won't be susceptible to the same things I was.
Well, hopefully when she, at the right age where she could, I guess, get her head around it, maybe reading a book would be helpful for her to understand
I
your
think
journey.
so. She'll say, Aunt Melanie, why didn't you tell me these things before? So yeah, I mean, when the time comes that she's old enough to talk about those things, I'll be honest with her and say, this is how I felt, and these are some of the things I did, and this is what I did to get better. And if you're feeling that way, I'm a safe person to talk to.
Well, she'll be very fortunate to have you.
Thank you.
Absolutely, Auntie Melanie. For sure. I guess one thing you mentioned as well is that you were, when it came to your eating and your diet, you were kind of measuring, you know, you weigh yourself daily, you track what you were eating, track your exercise. And certainly as we're living through this sort of technology evolution, which is awesome in many ways and enables us to, you know, chat like this when you're in Texas and I'm just south of Sydney in Australia. So technology can be a wonderful thing, and it can be around sport as well, but it can also be a curse. And more these days, you can kind of measure everything. And the direction we seem to be going with tech is that you can measure more and more. I mean, we use the Whoop wrist strap as part of our programs to track sleep, to track heart rate variability, to track all sorts of things. Wonderful metrics, which can be very useful if they're interpreted correctly and used for good. But the risk is, of course, that it becomes all-consuming. And for sure, some people I know are absolutely consumed with tracking what they do forever. You know, whatever they do, their Garmin seems to be involved, and it's counting this and it's tracking that, and there's an app for this and an app for that. As part of your recovery from your eating disorder, which obviously is an ongoing process, what practical steps have you taken to reduce that level of tracking, let's say?
I quit cold turkey. And it was interesting because I stopped weighing myself every day, but for a while I didn't tell my nutritionist or my therapist this. I was still tracking my exercise. So my iPhone app has a nice little thing where you can scroll and say, oh yes, I did Pilates, or I walked, or I did this. And so I would have to, you know, make sure it was 25 minutes or 26 minutes or how many laps I swam. And I was still doing that. And I finally realized, I just thought, oh, I'm still measuring and holding myself to the standard and having to track. And it's not like I even went back and looked at it. It was just some weird kind of security blanket where if I tracked it, then it was real.
That's right.
And so I stopped doing that. And I will say the urge to kind of look at the clock when I stop and start some kind of exercise is still there just a little bit.
Sure.
Today I was doing some exercise. I exercised and I stopped and did something else. And then I went back to do more exercise. And part of me was like, oh, you better look and see when you stop and start. I was like, nope, not doing that. So I just stopped. I stopped weighing myself. I did once. I was having a second knee surgery this year, and I knew they were going to ask me for, you know, the anesthesia purposes and all that. So I weighed myself before that happened, and I haven't done it since then. I'm very curious, but I also just know how that'll make me feel. And I think for me, part of it was just being patient and letting time do its job. But then also, I saw the immediate benefits of eating full meals. My problem was that they called an atypical anorexia. So I was at a somewhat healthy weight and I didn't really have a lot of medical problems, but I was severely restricting food. I was doing all of those perfectionist habits. The mental health part of it was there. So the anxiety and all of that. So I started eating normally because I wanted to commit to getting better. And it was just like a light went on and I thought, well, if I'd known all this time how much better I would feel, I would have stopped starving myself years ago. So I had that positive reinforcement of just,
good.
You know, my body has changed a little bit, but mentally I felt so much better. So I thought, I mean, I know what I could do right now to lose some of the weight that I've gained, but I don't want to go back to feeling that way. It felt so bad. Yeah. So I just had the positive reinforcement that my body is telling me, they're like, hey, you see how good this feels? Let's keep doing this.
It's kind of the best motivation, isn't it?
It really is. I think all I had to do is eat 3 squares meals and 2 snacks a day. Well, I mean, I knew, but I didn't want to do it.
And when you say your body's changed a little, that one sentence could hide a whole myriad of emotions, couldn't it?
Mm-hmm.
And I guess it's a general question that applies to all of us, I think, but to what standard do we hold ourselves in terms of our aesthetics? So when you say your body's changed a bit, almost as a byproduct of this conversation, that was a line that you used. What do you mean by that?
That may still be the eating disorder talking. It may be like, aha, you don't look the same anymore, therefore that is bad. So I have to be careful and watch my language, because what I'd really like to say is, well, I've gained weight, or my waist has gotten bigger, things like that. But just kind of recognizing that, I am getting older too. So just recognizing that your body changes all the time, and that's not a bad thing. And so I think it's kind of convincing myself that it's not a bad thing that my body may have changed a little bit, which nobody else has noticed but me. So it also shows me how much we scrutinize ourselves and notice all these little details about our bodies that nobody else is paying attention to. No one else cares. It doesn't reflect on who I am as a person. And I've had to remind myself, and my therapist reminded me too, I didn't like myself when I was at my lowest weight. I didn't like myself. I wasn't happy. I wasn't satisfied with who I was or what I looked like. So I could drop whatever weight I've gained now and go back to the weight I was when I was hating myself. So who wants to do that?
Absolutely. And for anyone listening to this that thinks I'm being a bit digging a little too far with my questions, Melanie gave me permission to just go wherever the conversation took us. So
you have my full permission to dig.
Absolutely. So I certainly wasn't psychoanalyzing anything in particular you said. It was just interesting. And it's interesting as well that you've, as you say, would I want to go back to feeling crappy? Of course I wouldn't. And I think people don't notice. What's interesting for me is when I was at the deepest, sort of biggest phase of my ultra endurance stuff, I stripped some body weight, and that was just a byproduct. For sure it was, but I hadn't quite got it right a few times and was too skinny and unhealthy. So no, I could see that it wasn't an intention, and then I'd change my diet and try and find my way in terms of what's the happy balance. But since I haven't been doing the ultra endurance stuff, most people in my life, and particularly those overseas who I don't see so often, they comment, they go, geez, you look so much better now than you did 2 or 3 years ago, and all that stuff. And it's funny, because I felt my best then. When I was my leanest, I felt great. I felt kind of bouncy and ready to go at anything every day. So I think I found a healthy balance. It wasn't that I was making me sick, but the perception of other people, for what it's worth, is that actually I look healthier now than I did back then, when my body composition was quite different. So it's not so much that people don't notice, but actually people might see it as a positive when we go, put a bit of weight back on. It's interesting for me at the time and I was quite conscious of my weight, the way I looked, but I think it was because I knew I'd got it wrong a few times and gone way too skinny and unhealthily so. And so it was always interesting for me that even now, people, you look so much better now. And so it's not that they don't notice. Often people are just looking out for our best interests, and they certainly, they don't care at the level we do. For sure, they're not looking at, most of them don't see the naked us in front of the mirror. And of course, whenever we look in the mirror, our eyes tend to go to the bits we're least happy with, that we're least satisfied about, let's say. But people don't see that. And that is something that we just have to manage for ourselves, isn't it? And find balance in that. But I'm certainly glad that, you'll certainly seem to be well down that path of having regained control of that, and have much more insight around it and self-reflection, which is obviously having a very positive impact in your life.
It's a good feeling.
Yeah, good, and which is awesome. Now, I'm conscious of time. The book. Tell us a little bit more about the book, because I certainly would love to help people get their hands on a copy of your book. book. If what we're discussing and your story is resonating with people, then of course, naturally, the book is a great place to go. And I think most people understand in our audience that whenever we're talking about any of our books, none of us are J.K. Rowling, none of us are making millions of dollars selling our books. It's a genuine desire to share a story. And I speak, with experience from that too. The book's not about making money, but it is a way of sharing your journey, your insights, your learnings, and the more people we can get that into the hands of, therefore, that this is resonating with, the better. So Kicking and Screaming, a memoir of madness and martial arts. Big picture, what's the journey the book takes us on?
The journey is a mental health journey. And so I will say, I love all the feedback that I've gotten from people. And it's great when fellow martial artists read it, but I like it even more when I have somebody say, I don't really care about martial arts. I'm not into Taekwondo, but your story of mental health recovery really resonated with me. And that's who I'm trying to reach. Memoirs are always little slices of life. And so, yes, you're going to learn about Taekwondo and martial arts and kind of the ins and outs of that. But more so, you're going to see a person having a reckoning with their mental illness and doing things to change the way they approach it. And I think that's a universal story. Sadness and loneliness are universal feelings, whether you've had mental illness or not. A lot of people experience depression without being diagnosed with depression. So it's a story of finding a way to overcome that and finding a way. It doesn't have to be Taekwondo. It could be whatever you want it to be, some kind of interest, maybe a person's religious faith or a sport or cooking or whatever that is. Find that thing that gives you joy. And so that's the story, is going from sadness and hopelessness to joy. And I think that's a universal experience many of us have.
Absolutely. No, thank you. And I love the way it's described as life lessons from a Taekwondo diva and master in the making. Very creative. You have a blog as well. Am I right?
I do. Yes, that's what you were, the Taekwondo Diva part, that's what you were reading. I wish I'd called it Taekwondo Diva. The blog is called Little Black Belt. So like a little black dress, it's a great accessory, but it's called Little Black Belt. And so it's just started as kind of an online diary. When I started doing Taekwondo training, I started it around 2014. So I wasn't a black belt at that point. And I was having all these insights and thoughts and ideas about life in general and what I was learning. And I just had to get it out of my head. So I started the blog, and eventually I realized I had enough of a story to write a book. And that's how that all started. And the blog is still going today.
Yeah, fantastic. Of course, we're going to put the links to everything we're talking about in the show notes, of course. Melanie, in the interest of time, we're going to have to wrap it up. But is there anything one sort of final thought you'd love to share with our audience? I mean, I appreciate you've been very, very generous and vulnerable and candid in our conversation. I've enjoyed it immensely. Like you said earlier, we could talk about it for hours, to be honest. Fascinating subjects. But is there anything, any sort of final thought you'd like to leave with the audience?
Yeah, my final thought is be an advocate for your mental health. So speak up for yourself in your personal life, in your professional life. Mental health is health. It's just as important as what we do with our bodies. So speak up for your mind and your emotional wellness.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you so much, Melanie. And I guess there you have it. So thanks very much for listening. And if you've enjoyed this, please go ahead and leave us a review on whichever platform you're using. It really does help more than you can know. And if you're interested in grabbing a copy of my book, Lead by Example, which talks about how you can unleash your potential at work and in life, I'd love to send a copy to you. So if you go to theimpactproject.io and take a dive down that rabbit hole, it'll be on your doorstep in no time. My thanks again to Melanie. We'll be posting, as I said, all of the various links to her book, Kicking and Screaming, and her blog and her website in the show notes. And until next time, of course, as always, be brave, have fun, and make yourself busy having an impact on the world.